Week 1 in the NFL is over, and for fantasy football, who are you going to add at the wide receiver position? Well, there's a lot of guys who are interesting, and we're going to talk about them today. In fact, there are 10 wide receivers that I think are worth picking up in fantasy leagues right now. That's how wonky Week 1 was. And for what it's worth, I've helped over 15,000 people win their fantasy leagues these last few years, and I'm going to help you do the same with this video. And we'll be starting with the New York Giants wide receiver Wan'Dale Robinson as he enters his third year in the league, a former second-round pick. And look, I know the Giants offense was pretty atrocious in Week 1. I get that. They face a tough defense. They're going to have a good matchup in Week 2, so hear me out. Wan'Dale Robinson was the wide receiver 3. He was a starting wide receiver for this offense. Malik Neighbors, we already know Malik Neighbors. We've been very high on him. He had a good game despite the poor quarterback play in Week 1. He's the clear number 1 receiver. Darius Slayton is the number 2 receiver. This is what we were told in camp in the preseason if you were paying attention. And then Wan'Dale Robinson plays the third most snaps, easily ahead of Jalen Hyatt here, runs 37 routes, easily ahead of the 9 that Jalen Wyatt ran. But here's the thing, 11 targets from Daniel Jones. And this makes sense because the Giants offensive line was once again bad, just like it was last season. And Daniel Jones had to get the ball out quick. And like he's done in the past, he was targeting Wan'Dale Robinson short. In fact, he targeted Robinson so much that according to Jacob Gibbs on Twitter, this is before the Monday Night Football game, by the way, came out. This is what the target share was for Wan'Dale Robinson. 32%, which was the 7th highest on the week. He'll probably finish the week as a top 10 targeted wide receiver in terms of target share. And again, yes, how valuable are those targets is a question when they're coming from Daniel Jones. But if he keeps up this volume, he's going to have to be somebody who comes off the waivers and onto your team. Now, Robinson hasn't had the healthiest career so far in the NFL. I mean, look at all these injuries through just 2 seasons. It started off as a rookie where he gets a knee injury in Week 1, then a hamstring strain, which stinks for all types of players, especially wide receiver. Tears his ACL to end 2022, and that's going to affect your 2023 play when you have a torn ACL. That's what we saw here. He still had some limitations from that, then injures his quad towards the end of last season. I mean, this guy is just being banged up. When he's actually out there and healthy, though, he's earning targets often in that short area of the field. And in this game, you can see he operated as the wide receiver 3. This is via PFF, by the way. He did operate as a wide receiver 3, but he was on the field often. This team is going to run a lot of 3 wide receiver sets when they're going to have to pass often. That's what they want to do, is use 3 wide receiver sets under Brian Daboll, especially if they're trailing. They're going to have to throw more to keep up like they did in Week 1. So I'm not concerned about Wan'Dale Robinson not being an outside wide receiver. We kind of already knew that was going to be the case. He was going to be mostly a slot receiver, but in this game, according to PFF, he did play 2 snaps on the outside for what it's worth. And just to show you exactly what Wan'Dale Robinson has done in his first 2 years, I mean, look at his yards per reception. 9.9 as a rookie in yards per reception, 8.8 last year in his second season. For some reference, you want this number ideally to be like 11 to 12 to have some upside, right? Some downfield usage. He's not getting that. This is a guy who last year, if we look at his average depth of target, was just 5.3 yards downfield. 5.3 yards downfield, 97th in the NFL. Now, you might be saying, oh, but Rashee Rice had a similar average depth of target last year. Yeah, but Rashee Rice was seeing over 100 targets with Patrick Mahomes in an Andy Reid offense and proved he can produce after the catch, right? And even then, I've had some questions about Rashee Rice's role heading into this year, although he had a great Week 1. So Wan'Dale Robinson, yes, the role isn't elite because he's not going to see downfield usage, but when we're talking about the waiver wires in Week 1, there's not a ton of elite wide receivers available. They were all drafted, but you got a guy who saw 11 targets and should continue to see a lot of targets. That's what he's done in the NFL so far in his career in the coming weeks, especially next week where he has a good matchup. And for what it's worth, Wan'Dale did see a rush attempt in this game. Last year, he was averaging about 1 rush attempt and 10 yards on the ground per game, so it's something to note. All right, now the next man I want to talk about is kind of like another Wan'Dale Robinson type player, and that's Greg Dortch for the Arizona Cardinals, who had a solid season debut. It was actually a productive day for Greg Dortch and the entire Cardinals offense. You can see right here, like Wan'Dale Robinson, Greg Dortch was the number 3 receiver on his team, played 37 snaps behind Marvin Harrison Jr., the number 1 overall, or the number 1 first round pick for the Cardinals, their number 1 pick. Michael Wilson here, a former 3rd round pick, I believe, in last year's NFL draft. And then the routes run 26, so he runs about 10 less routes than these guys, meaning he's mostly a slot receiver, but he doubles them up in targets, triples them up in targets in some instances, has 8 targets compared to just 3 for Marvin Harrison Jr. and 2 for 1 Michael Wilson. I mean, some people will write this off and say there's nothing to it, like we got to stop with this Greg Dortch stuff. Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to see more targets in future weeks, and that's true. But Kyler Murray likes Greg Dortch. He literally hyped him up all off season last year. He's hyped him up all off season this year, and he's continued to produce Greg Dortch every single time he gets opportunities. So there is something to this. I don't think we should just write it off completely. Yes, he's not going to be starting over some top 24 and top 36 wide receivers for you, but he's at least considering, or somebody worth considering to pick up off waivers, especially if you're in a 3 wide receiver league with a couple of bench spots and or a couple of flex spots. You can see right here, in a week where the Cardinals offense looked good without even scoring a touchdown, he has 7 touches, also picks up that rush attempt, goes over 10 fantasy points, which is encouraging when you're talking about him leading his team in targets with 8, tied with, I believe, Trey McBride, the tight end on this team. And for what it's worth, Greg Dortch is the most tenured wide receiver on this team. If you're looking through them all, Zay Jones was signed this offseason. Xavier Weaver is a younger player. Zach Pascal signed this offseason. Chris Moore recently picked up, right? A first-round rookie, a second-year player. Greg Dortch being on this team for just 3 years alone makes him the most tenured guy, which already gives him some built-in chemistry with Kyler Murray. And look, look, yes, Marvin Harrison is not going to just have one catch moving forward. He's probably going to most weeks see minimum 4, probably 5 to 6 plus catches, and that will impact Greg Dortch, but that's to be expected. Most weeks as well, we're going to see a couple more pass attempts out of Kyler Murray, and we're probably going to see some touchdown potential out of Greg Dortch. Again, this is not a top 36 receiver for the rest of the season. It's a guy to be adding for your bench opportunities, and maybe we see what happens from there because he's produced often when given chances. And I think there's a decent chance he produces next week because the Cardinals are going to get a Rams team that the defense looked better than expected on Sunday Night Football against the Lions. But look at this, a 50-point total right here, and the Cardinals are home underdogs of 1.5. Normally, this is a great spot for fantasy production when the total in a game is 50. It's one of the highest on the weeks. We saw that on Sunday Night Football when the Rams were in the only game of the week that had a 50-plus point total, and now the Cardinals being home underdogs is a favorite or a nice situation for them to pass more than people probably expect. So another nice situation for the overall offense, including Greg Dortch. Now, the next situation I want to talk about takes us to that other side of the ball for that Rams and Cardinals matchup next week, and it's the Rams, because I want to talk about these guys right here. I want to talk about number 1, Demarcus Robinson, and number 2, Tyler Johnson, because of what they did this past weekend on Sunday Night Football. They saw a lot more usage, and there was a clear reason for this. Mr. Puka Nacua left the game with, let's say it, a knee injury that he was dealing with in the preseason, a bursa sac injury. I believe this is probably what got re-injured, although I don't know for sure. He did not return to the game on Sunday. They're saying it's not a serious issue, so we do have to monitor this. Maybe he doesn't even miss any time, and then these guys are not worth adding. But as of the information we have today, he's probably going to be limited in practice. We'll see what happens. So we have to seriously consider, and I'll go back to these guys here, seriously consider Demarcus Robinson and Tyler Johnson, and let's break it down. Now, in this game, Puka Nacua played 25 snaps and ran 15 routes before leaving with that injury. And then Demarcus Robinson, he was already starting in this game. He was a top 3 receiver for them last year, and he was operating like that. You can see he played 72 snaps, ran 47 routes, earned 7 targets. Maybe even more impressively, Tyler Johnson, a former Tampa Bay Buccaneer, he's been a solid slot wide receiver from his time in college, as well as with the Tampa Bay Bucs in limited outings. 51 snaps, 33 routes, also earned 7 targets. So somebody in the middle of the field that won without Tyler Higbee being there, a security blanket for Matt Stafford over the years. Looked like Tyler Johnson was that security blanket. So he's a name to think about in your super deep leagues. But I personally want to look at Demarcus Robinson, who over his final 5 games last season was a top 12 fantasy receiver, and that's with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua out there for those games. Basically, Sean McVay used Robinson as a downfield option, and Robinson was able to steal the job from Tutu Atwell last year, and we saw that again last night where Robinson played over Atwell and was being used downfield. Robinson saw a career-high 14.3 yards per catch last season, which is a great role to have with somebody like Matthew Stafford, and we saw that continue at times in the Sunday Night Football game against the Detroit Lions. So these guys are interesting names to add, and before we keep going, I do want to let you know about the schedule this week for the Fantasy Blueprint that over 15,000 of you have access to, and if you don't, you can get access right now. The waiver wire tools are already out. We have the key stats database going out. The rest of season rankings go out on Wednesdays. Thursday's the big day. Rankings and projections for that specific week for every single position. Over 100 wide receivers, 70 running backs, 50 tight ends. I rank so many players. Depending on the league you're in, you'll have an opportunity there. And then this is the big one. Game by game matchup notes is every single game, every fantasy relevant player. I'll talk about their matchup, wide receiver cornerbacks versus the overall secondary, offense versus defensive line, all this and more. Now, if you're wondering where you can get it in my Fantasy Blueprint, which is linked down below. We'll also put a QR code up on the screen in a second when I'm back on the full screen. So you can see right here, you can click this button, you get access to the Fantasy Blueprint, risk-free this year through one of our 2 partners below. There'll be steps to follow for it, and it's as simple as that. You get all those tools every single week. And what does risk-free means? It means if you sign up through one of our 2 partners, it's just a one-time payment of $10 for the entire year. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I 100% refund that $10 to you, no questions asked. So to get access to your Fantasy Blueprint that over 15,000 people are currently using, and it's the tools that I use in all my leagues, you can scan this QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below right now. And again, this is a limited time offer, so be sure to take advantage of it. Not now, but right now. All right, next up, let's talk about a veteran. And it's kind of boring to talk about a guy in Brandon Cooks on the Dallas Cowboys. He's a number 2 offense on a strong, or number 2 receiver on a strong offense. And when he's healthy, he produces. But it's kind of boring because the guy's about to turn 31 years old. He's been in the NFL forever, a 2014 first round pick during that time. So many years ago, he's played for so many different teams, right? You want to go back to all the years that he's playing with like the Saints. He ends up playing with the Rams in the past, right? This is a guy who's been all over the place, but sometimes the boring is the right way to go. Because this offseason, there was no competition brought in for Brandon Cooks. Like, they only signed Ryan Flowney or drafted a late round wide receiver, didn't add any wide receivers in free agency. They let Michael Gallup go, who then later retired. And now you're looking at Brandon Cooks in an offense where he just produced in week 1, more on that in a second. And Jake Ferguson, the tight end, might miss some time with a knee injury. So when I see player profiler stats and Brandon Cooks is leading the team in snaps and routes run over CeeDee Lamb, he picks up 7 targets, which is nice. We know that he found the end zone and had a solid week 1, as you can see right here, goes for over 14 points, 4 catches on those 7 targets, 40 yards and a touchdown. We know his quarterback is good in Dak Prescott. They blew out the Cleveland Browns. You can see the score on the screen right now. That's not going to happen every week, so Dak will have to throw more in future weeks than he did against the Browns in week 1. So when we factor all of this in, the fact that Brandon Cooks is available in about 60% of fantasy leagues right now is probably too low. He should be on the benches of more leagues because he's the number 2 clear-cut option, especially now with Jake Ferguson hurt for Dak Prescott and the Cowboys, and that's valuable. Speaking of the number 2 options on offenses that could be valuable with good quarterbacks, let's go to this next guy. And that's Andrei Iosivas of the Cincinnati Bengals. He is a 6th-round, second-year player. He was a 6th-round pick last year for them. He's about 25 years old, so he's still young in the prime of his career. Now, I say he's a second or the second option for Joe Burrow because I'm expecting T. Higgins to probably miss at least another week with a hamstring injury that he picked up midway through the week last week. Now, like Brandon Cooks, Andrei Iosivas actually surprisingly led the Bengals in snaps and routes run ahead of Jamar Chase, who we knew coming into this game, the reports said he would be limited, so that's probably why. And Iosivas saw 5 targets, the second most on this team. Now, the Bengals offense against the Patriots in week 1 stunk. The Patriots defense was absolutely great against them. Joe Burrow did not look right. We're hoping that the wrist isn't a reason for that, and maybe just not having T. Higgins and Jamar Chase being limited is more of a reason. But Iosivas is a guy who had a very good camp and OTAs and just a whole preseason. There was hype around him. He's an extremely athletic player. He has nice size. His speed, a 4.43 at his size, is 91st percentile, 96th percentile catch radius, has great bursts at 88th percentile. So this is a guy that I do think you can actually go out there and probably start for at least 1 more week, maybe 2 weeks, depending on how severe the hamstring is for T. Higgins. We'll see what happens there because there's not much other competition here. Charlie Jones and Trent Irwin, we know what they are. They're not going to be threatening. Iosivas, who's a bigger player, a downfield threat. And Jermaine Burton is a rookie who I think in super deep leagues, we're talking 16 to 20 team leagues, you could add him right now because I do think he's a talented rookie out of Alabama, led Alabama in college football the past 2 years in catches and receptions, or receptions, I should say catches and receiving yards. So he's an interesting name to mention, but right now, based on all the usage that we're seeing, it's Iosivas who is the clear number 2 on this team while T. Higgins is out. But even when Higgins returns, is the number 3 on an offense that should play better moving forward. Next up, I want to talk about an Indianapolis Colts second-year receiver, the former second-round pick, and that's going to be, actually, it's a third-year receiver now at this point, and that's going to be Alec Pierce, who, look, I'm going to tell you, actually, do not draft this guy, and here's why. Look, I get it. He had 100 yards, and he had a touchdown, and he looked great. These 2 big catches on 3 targets. It was just 3 targets, people. Sure, he ends up playing 38 snaps. He was a number 1 receiver on this team. He runs 20 routes ahead of Adonai Mitchell as barely the number 2 option on this team, but he sees 2 less targets than Adonai Mitchell. Adonai Mitchell could have had 2 touchdowns in this game, so that's a name to keep in mind. I'd rather add the rookie Adonai Mitchell, who's a more explosive player than Pierce, and should have had 2 touchdowns if Anthony Richardson just didn't completely miss him. He definitely would have had at least 1. He was running wide open. But this is the whole thing. We have to look at the underlying usage. That's why I'm here. The overall 100 yards. I don't care about the 2 deep passes that got completed. That's not going to happen. You're not going to catch 2 50-yard balls on 3 targets every week. And there's also the fact that, yes, Michael Pittman's on this team, led the team with 8 targets in week 1, but Josh Downs is going to be back soon. He could be back as soon as week 2. If not, okay, maybe we see him in week 3 more likely is what I'm suggesting or guessing, but we could see him in week 2, and Josh Downs was great as a rookie. I mean, we're talking fantastic as a rookie last year. 3rd-round pick that really paid off, was able to win on the outside and downfield across 17 games where he wasn't even a full-time receiver until a couple weeks into the season. Still had 98 targets, so almost pushed towards 100 targets, which, by the way, is basically similar to what Rashee Rice did with the Chiefs last year, 102 target season. So when I factor all that in right now, like Alec Pierce is available in like 80% of fantasy leagues, but Josh Downs is available in like 75%. I'd rather just have Josh Downs. If I'm spending a waiver priority, and if I had to, and by the way, you don't have to, but if I had to pick a Colts wide receiver to add right now, I would pick up Josh Downs, then Adonai Mitchell number 2, then Alec Pierce number 3. Yes, that's the way I would do it. Next up, I want to talk about a player that you could add in some deeper leagues, but he might actually see a bigger role as soon as this week. And that's the Vikings wide receiver, a 3rd-year receiver here in Jalen Nailor, who had a fantastic preseason in camp, and last week he actually had some production. And now the reason I do want to talk about him, it wasn't any insane production last week with Sam Darnold in week 1 for the Vikings, but there's an injury to his wide receiver core. And that injury is to Jordan Addison, who injured his ankle. And this has been a guy who's already dealing with a right ankle injury, kind of came back pretty soon from what was said to be a right high ankle sprain. He came back in just 2 weeks, usually a 4 to 6 week recovery. Now, though, the reports are that this is actually an injury to his left ankle. He did not return on Sunday, and there's a chance, even if this is just a mild ankle injury, that he's going to miss 1 to 2 games. We'll have to see what the reports are. And if that's the case, the Vikings wide receiver room, especially without TJ Hawkinson, gets pretty thin. Now, we know Justin Jefferson will have a big role, but then after that, Jalen Nailor looks like the number 2 option on this team. They do have veteran Brandon Powell, and if we look at PFF snaps from this first game, Brandon Powell did play more snaps, 30, and run routes, 13, compared to Jalen Nailor, but Nailor got going in the second half once Addison left. He started to pick up all his routes. That's where he had his 1 target on a trick play, which actually went for a touchdown. So this is somebody in like a deeper league, 12 to 14 teams. If you're really in a bind this week, maybe you don't have Addison and some other guys, T. Higgins, you're dealing with injuries. He's somebody, if the other names you've already mentioned are gone, you could pick up and try and slot in there, or at least keep on your bench while Addison starts to heal his body. Now, the next man I'm going to talk about, yes, he's not a receiver, but he basically is a receiver in terms of how he produces, and that's going to be Isaiah Likely. You know we had to talk about this guy after having a fantastic fantastic Thursday night where he was the #1 overall scoring tight end. On a week where tight ends just stunk all over the place, the best ones, a lot of them got injured. He did not. 111 catches, 1 touchdown, was almost 2 touchdowns. It was just basically a centimeter away. And then he had 12 targets from Lamar Jackson. We have to talk about this because he's probably the #1 waiver wire ad across every single position right now. And look, I don't think that Mark Andrews is all of a sudden not valuable in fantasy. I would still rank Andrews ahead of Isaiah Likely, and I hope you would too, and not have the recency bias of just one game for the rest of the season. Andrews played 59 snaps, ran 38 routes, and you can see right here, Likely 53 snaps, 35 routes, but the big thing, 12 targets for Likely, just 2 for Andrews. But I would like to point out that in this game, Andrews was coming in injured. He practiced on Tuesday for the first time in like 6 weeks. This dude had an offseason, I believe, motorcycle accident or car accident he was in. He's still banged up in my opinion, and I think that showed in week 1. But that doesn't mean we just completely ignore that Isaiah Likely was a beast. And this offense for the Rams, they probably want to operate out of 2 tight end sets either way, even when Andrews is 100% healthy. And we know that Isaiah Likely can produce. I mean, this is a guy who once he entered the NFL was productive when Mark Andrews missed some time. During college, his final year, 59 catches, 912 yards. This doesn't sound like a lot if you're talking about like NFL receivers you're comparing him to, but for a college tight end to have 50 catches, that's like top 1 percentile. And anything over like 550 receiving yards is great. And this dude, again, had 912 and even had 600 the year before that, an insane 24% target share in college, the #1 receiver for his team while he was playing for Coastal Carolina. Very impressive, very rare for a tight end to be doing this in college. Now look, I'm not expecting 100+ yard games every week for Isaiah Likely because the pure fact is like nobody had 100+ yard games last year. There's very few tight ends. I think there's only like 6 or 7 that had 100-yard games last year, so we don't have to keep expecting this, but 5 catch performances for 50, 60 yards and a touchdown, that's definitely in the cards. Based on the fact that the wide receiver position at the waivers isn't as strong this week and there's only a couple of running backs that I'm really keying in on, I think Likely, Mr. Isaiah Likely, is the top waiver wire ad this week. But again, don't blow your entire budget on him. He's a tight end still competing with Mark Andrews in what should be a run-first offense. You want to save your fab budget. Here's a tip for you for those high-end, high-upside running backs. That's what you want to save your budget for. Now, I want to talk about some guys in some of your deeper leagues. I know there's people out there watching this that are like, all these guys are already picked up in my league. Well, I'm going to give you some deeper names. But before we do, over 65% of you are not subscribed to this YouTube channel. My goal is to get that number to as close as 50% by the end of the year. Here's the thing. I know a lot of you just don't remember to. You're watching on your TV or watching on your phone, but here's your urge to do so. It's a gentleman's agreement. If you find these videos helpful, the gentleman's agreement is that you hit the subscribe button. It's totally free, and it truly helps me and my channel a lot. It helps them more than you know, so I appreciate it. It will let me get out more videos and quicker content to you. So hit that subscribe button if you find these videos helpful. Gentleman's agreement. Don't break it. Now, one of those players who's available in deeper leagues, and this will be the start of it, and then we'll get deeper, is going to be Devon Veely. He's a 7th round. Yes, a 7th round rookie. And here's the crazy part. A 7th round rookie, 26 years old. I don't know if Player Profile is right on this. This is the first time I'm seeing that. That's crazy, but he's a very talented player. And we'll talk about his usage from week 1 in a second, but he's a big receiver with 4.4 speed. It's about 215 pounds, 86 percentile speed, has a nice catch radius. Somebody that his own coach, that we'll show you in a second, Sean Payton, has hyped up this offseason. And here's the deal. The Broncos offense stunk in week 1. It was absolutely atrocious. I mean, Bo Nix barely had like 150 passing yards, and he was awful on his 40+ attempts, but we did see Veely catch all 8 of his targets for 39 yards. You would like to see this number be closer if you're going to have 8 catches to 70+ yards, but it's a starting point for a guy who is a 7th round rookie. Usually you don't see 7th round rookie receivers putting up 12 fantasy points on 8 targets in week 1 of a season. You would assume it's only going to get better from there. And really, the Broncos offense can only get better from there. I mean, it kind of stunk up the joint, but Veely was a starting receiver. You see right here, 34 snaps, only less than Josh Reynolds and Courtland Sutton, the veterans on this team. You can see here, 31 routes run. He had 8 targets as well, the second most on the team behind Sutton. And if we want to look at some stuff, this offseason, he was getting some hype from Sean Payton. I like his size and his hands in traffic. I thought he had a couple of snaps now this week where, man, we got to keep giving him opportunities. That was during the joint practices and the preseason. And what did they do in week 1? They gave him opportunities, and he caught 100% of the balls thrown his way. Now, I will say that his competition, this is Player Profiler, the competition he has this week. Marvin Mims wasn't involved in the offense. We know it's Sutton and Josh Reynolds. There'll be starters. Troy Franklin, Veely is ahead of, and then there's little Jordan Humphrey, who got used in this game ahead of both Mims and Troy Franklin, but not a ton. So it looks like Veely right now is the clear number 3 receiver on his team, and I get it. Bo Nix didn't look great in week 1. The offense stunk in week 1, but we should be expecting some big changes heading into week 2. That's naturally what happens in the NFL. And if there was a player that we can maybe see some upside come out of nowhere from in this offense, and a name that pops up in fantasy leagues that nobody was expecting to finish as, let's just say, a top 48 wide receiver at the end of the year, I do think a 7th round rookie who's showing this much promise this early is somebody to at least consider moving forward. He's not a priority ad by any means, but I know there's sickos out there in some deeper leagues where this guy's 99% available in most leagues. He's probably available in yours. And maybe the same could be said for Xavier Legette, who's actually a 1st round pick, not a 7th round pick by the Carolina Panthers. This is somebody that they traded up for in the NFL draft to get that 5th-year option on him in round 1. And Xavier Legette, again, a part of an offense that absolutely stunk in week 1 under Bryce Young, got absolutely boat raced by the New Orleans Orleans Saints, a somewhat tougher defense to face in week 1 for Bryce Young. But here's the deal. Legette is a first-round pick, and I mean, this dude's just an absolute stud. 221 pounds at 6'1", so he's a beast in terms of size, and he also has the speed. At that size, he ran a 4.39 insane, 98th percentile speed, 89th percentile burst, and 88th percentile catch radius. All that has to say is that he's an elite athlete with some crazy traits. And in college last year, it took him a while to break out. It took until his 5th year to have over 1,200 yards. He had a 24% target share. He caught 71 balls. Now you might be saying, oh, why did it take him so long to break out? Well, let me tell you why. He ended up getting in a motorcycle accident during his time in college. He lost both his mom and dad towards the end of high school and into college. So yeah, I think these things are going to probably make it harder to develop as football because that comes second to all those other things, right? And this is a guy that I'm just happy to root for, right? Because of his backstory. And in week 1, look, yes, the Panthers threw more than they're probably going to throw most weeks, although they could be trailing a lot of weeks, but he did have 7 targets. He did catch 4 balls for 35 yards. And if we talk about his overall route tree and usage, like, yes, he's behind Adam Thielen and Deontay Johnson on this team, but he was the wide receiver 3 in terms of snaps and routes run. Jonathan Mingo was also involved. They had David Moore involved, so they were rotating 5 total guys, but Xavier Legette led the team with 7 targets. That's saying something that he was able to earn these targets, a big body receiver, really the only receiver on this team, in my opinion, that can consistently win downfield with both speed and ability to produce after the catch. You're not going to get that out of Adam Thielen and Deontay Johnson. So again, this is for your deeper leagues. This is not a guy that you're picking up off the waivers and starting in your lineups. He's a guy that you put on your bench because he's a first-round rookie wide receiver with a ton of talented traits. And if this offense can just get going, which I do think there's a ton of investment both in the new coaching staff, the offensive line, and the playmakers around Bryce Young, that week 1, that absolutely offense, the way the offense looked awful, I do think it's going to have to improve from that. We're going to keep getting deeper here with Jalen McMillan, a 3rd-round rookie, as you can see right here, the 22-year-old out of Washington for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Look, this is a guy who almost had 2 big touchdowns in week 1, but lucky for him, he at least got one of those. He had 10 fantasy points in his first outing out there. All the starting wide receivers, Godwin, Mike Evans, and even Jalen McMillan, who was a starting wide receiver, they all found the end zone in this game. Now, just 1 catch for that 32-yard touchdown, but he had 3 targets, and one of those targets, he should have had a 2nd touchdown, but Baker Mayfield missed him. Now, as for the usage, like I said, he was the clear number 3 receiver on this team, and actually, he played the most snaps on this team with 52 snaps. 29 routes run led the team, was playing easily ahead of Trey Palmer, who only played 20 snaps. So McMillan is a clear top 3 receiver on this team. Of course, Evans and Godwin are ahead of him, but if something happens to either of those guys, McMillan's now a top 2 option in an offense that looks like they want to pass the ball often out of 3 wide receiver sets under new offensive coordinator Liam Coen. So consider adding him in your deeper leagues, and then look to Darnell Mooney, who's actually available in over 80% of fantasy leagues right now. And look, I get it. Darnell Mooney is again on another offense in the Atlanta Falcons in week 1 that looked like crap, but Darnell Mooney playing 53 snaps, the clear number 2 receiver on this team behind Drake London. Of course, Kyle Pitts is there as basically a tight end as well, but he ran 28 routes, 100% of the routes run right there with Drake London and Kyle Pitts, and he only earned 3 targets. Like, we're not going to go crazy about his fantasy production. 1 catch for 15 yards, but also Drake London only had like 1 or 2 catches in this game. Kyle Pitts, if he doesn't find the end zone, only has like 10 yards in this game. The overall offense stunk as Kirk Cousins didn't look mobile. They didn't do any play action passing. He barely can move in the pocket. That's a concern, but again, we're hoping it gets better heading into week 2 and beyond. Because for the most part, it just has to for some of these offenses. I think the fact that none of them are taking part in the preseason and barely going into joint practices is making them rusty to start the year. And let's keep in mind that Darnell Mooney is a guy that they signed to a 3-year contract, probably overpaid for him this offseason. And if you look at his last 2 seasons where he was banged up for a couple weeks, you'll see, only 31 catches and 40 catches. Yes, that's not great, but keep in mind, he played for a Chicago Bears offense that was bottom 5 in passing volume the past 2 years, and last year, Justin Fields was 32nd in accuracy for them. It was a brutal situation for Darnell Mooney. Before that, he had a 1,000-yard receiving season. And now we're hoping that that can happen in this Falcons offense that, again, looked atrocious week 1, but we're hoping it gets better and gets more improved as we move forward, and that was just a 1-week thing. Now, back to the tight end position quickly, because, this guy's basically a receiver. He's catching passes out there, but blocking as well, and it's Colby Parkinson, somebody we talked about towards the end of the fantasy draft season as somebody you can take in deeper leagues as a late-round pick. He's the starting tight end for the Rams, and we saw really good usage in the first game. Tyler Higbee probably going to miss at least half the season. We saw him play 69 of a possible 78 snaps, so that's great. He ran 42 routes and earned 5 targets in this game. And if you're looking at the production that he had, pretty good. 4 catches on 5 targets for 47 yards. About 9 fantasy points these days for a tight end is pretty good because it's basically, do you score a touchdown or not for you to finish as a top 10 option? And when you factor in that Puka Nacua might be dealing with an injury now that maybe forces him to miss a week or 2, we'll see what the reports say. Well, then Colby Parkinson becomes even more appealing, especially in your deeper leagues. He's one of the top 2 waiver wire adds right behind Isaiah Likely at the tight end position for me this week. So these are all the pass catchers, wide receivers, tight ends that you need to be adding before week 2 in fantasy football, whether in a shallow or a deep league. Now, we also did a video on the running backs, 7 of them that you need to be adding before week 2 and before your friends do in the waivers pass. So be sure to check out this video as well right here. Appreciate you all a ton. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you all in the next one. The videos the rest of the week, we're talking trades, baby. Running backs, wide receivers to target. Be ready.